The sea was calm that morning, almost too calm. The yacht Wanda, with its polished wooden hull and brass fittings, gleamed beneath a pale English sun. It should have been a day for leisure, a day for the sea to whisper peace. But in May 1940, nothing about the sea was peaceful. Not when it stretched toward Dunkirk. Not when thousands of young men were stranded on the other side. Waiting to die. She was an unlikely hero, a private pleasure yacht, built for summer cruises and champagne sunsets. Now stripped of luxury and loaded with jerry cans, blankets, and the quiet dread of war. Around her, hundreds of small boats gathered in marinas, docks, and fishing harbors all along the English coast. None of them belonged to soldiers. They belonged to bakers, teachers, fishermen, to men who had never fired a gun but knew how to steer through a storm. What happened next would change history. Everyone knows the legend of Dunkirk, the military miracle. They call it the evacuation that saved an army from total annihilation. But what if the true miracle wasn't military at all? What if it came not from admirals and destroyers, but from ordinary men and their tiny boats, the civilian navy? Because when the Royal Navy's plans began to collapse, when steel giants were sinking in flames, it was these wooden hulls and trembling hands that turned the tide. The truth is this: it wasn't just 338,000 soldiers who were rescued on those beaches. It was a nation's faith dragged back across the channel by a fleet of weekend sailors who refused to look away. France had fallen. In late May 1940, nearly 400,000 Allied troops, British, French, and Belgian, were trapped on the northern coast. The German army was closing in like a tightening fist. The Luftwaffe rained fire from the sky. There was no shelter, no escape, only the wide, shallow beaches of Dunkirk and the cold waters of the Channel behind them. They called it Operation Dynamo. But to the men stranded there, it was simply a countdown to death. And back in England, in quiet seaside towns from Dover to Poole, news crackled over radios, reports of chaos, of encirclement, of the British Expeditionary Force cornered against the sea. There was panic, disbelief, and then something else. A decision no one had ever made before in modern war. When the Navy's great ships could not reach the stranded soldiers, when the deep-drafted destroyers ran aground in the sands and became easy prey for German bombers, the call went out. All privately owned vessels between 30 and 100 feet are to be made available for immediate service in the evacuation of Dunkirk. No training, no command, no certainty of return. Just one desperate chance to save an army. And so, as dawn broke on May 27th, the waters of the Channel began to fill with the most extraordinary fleet the world had ever seen. Yachts, tugboats, fishing smacks, lifeboats, even river barges. Some crewed by Navy men, but many more by their owners, civilians who had simply said, "We're going." The Wanda was among them, her sails replaced by diesel fumes, her deck crowded with life jackets and hope. The air reeked of salt and fear. And as she pulled away from the dock, one could almost feel history shift, quietly, against all odds, because this was no ordinary rescue. This was defiance, born not in command centers, but in kitchens and harbors, in the hearts of men who refused to let their sons and brothers die alone. The war had shown them its cruelest face. Now they were about to show it what courage really looked like. Dunkirk wasn't the end. It was the moment ordinary people proved they could hold a nation together. At the beginning, the Admiralty still believed the Navy could handle it. Confidence was abundant, perhaps too abundant. The Royal Navy's initial plan was simple and, on paper, sufficient. Evacuate 45,000 men in 2 days using destroyers and transport ships. It was a number chosen not from realism, but from pride. The British Empire had always trusted its navy. The Channel was their home, their fortress moat. How hard could it be to bring their boys back? But war is merciless to arrogance. By the second day, that confidence began to collapse. German artillery had reached the coast, and Luftwaffe dive bombers turned the beaches into killing grounds. The great destroyers of the Royal Navy, gleaming in gray steel, were now bright targets for German pilots. One after another, they were hit. Some caught fire and burned like floating torches. Others capsized, taking hundreds of soldiers with them. The Admiralty's nightmare was just beginning. The geography of Dunkirk itself turned against them. The beaches were too shallow, the sand too soft. The large naval ships with their deep hulls couldn't come closer than a mile from shore. Soldiers were forced to wade chest-deep into the icy water, climbing onto tiny rafts or swimming toward the faint outlines of ships on the horizon. Many never made it. Radio messages from Dunkirk were filled with desperation. Officers pleaded for more ships, for air cover, for anything. But the reality was brutal. The great navy of Britain, the pride of the empire, could not save its own army. Then came the moment that changed everything. A single, extraordinary order was issued, one that no military strategist would have ever written in a manual. Requisition all available small craft capable of crossing the channel. Civilian vessels are to report to the nearest port for immediate service. Fishing boats, river barges, tugs, pleasure yachts, anything that could float. Within hours, an unlikely fleet began to assemble. In harbors across southern England, ordinary people listened to the call and understood what it meant. It was not a command. It was a plea. In Poole, an old fisherman named Harold Walker stepped onto his weathered trawler and kissed his wife goodbye. In Ramsgate, a schoolteacher named George Martin volunteered his 30-foot sailing boat, saying only, "If I can take one man off that beach, it will be worth it." Across the coastline, hundreds followed, pushing their boats into the water, men with trembling hands. Engines sputtering, hearts steady. No medals promised. No glory guaranteed. Only a horizon filled with smoke and the knowledge that their country was bleeding. As the tide turned and hundreds of small vessels pointed their bows toward France, the impossible began to feel within reach. For the first time in days, the soldiers trapped at Dunkirk would soon see something on the water. Not warships, not destroyers, but the silhouettes of home itself. And in that moment, Britain's salvation no longer belonged to its admirals. It belonged to its people. The first to appear on the horizon were barely visible, dots on the water, shimmering in the morning haze. To the soldiers on the beach, half mad from exhaustion and fear, it looked like a mirage. But as the minutes passed, those dots became shapes, and those shapes became boats. Hundreds of them, fishing trawlers, motor launches, sailboats with names like Sea Spirit, Endeavor, Wanda. They came in clusters, weaving through smoke and debris, each wave of them smaller than the last destroyer that had sunk. But they kept coming, stubborn, fearless, relentless. The little ships of Dunkirk, as history would later call them. The Navy officers couldn't believe their eyes. The logistics alone were chaos. Yet somehow, these small vessels began to succeed where the great ships had failed. The problem had never been bravery. It had been size. The vast destroyers couldn't get near the beaches, but these little boats, these humble, unarmored things, could glide right up to the sand. They became lifelines, ferrying men from the shore to larger ships anchored farther out, running back and forth through enemy fire like ants saving their colony. Each crossing carried dozens of men, sometimes hundreds over the course of a day. Some boats were piloted by naval reservists, others by the very civilians who owned them. It didn't matter who was at the wheel. What mattered was that they refused to stop. On the second day, Luftwaffe planes swept low, strafing the water, dropping bombs that sent walls of spray and fire into the air. Yet the small boats scattered like minnows, too small, too agile to hit. One moment they vanished into smoke, the next they reappeared, engines coughing, still moving forward. Their very weakness became their armor. A Royal Navy commander later described it perfectly. They were ghosts on the sea, too many, too small, too determined to die. By June 2nd, the numbers were staggering. Over 700 civilian vessels had joined the operation. The official Navy evacuation capacity, minus 45,000 men, had been surpassed tenfold. Over 300,000 soldiers had been rescued, many of them hauled aboard by the hands of fishermen and weekend sailors. One soldier, Private Alan Thompson, later wrote in his diary, "When I saw them coming, I cried. They weren't warships. They were home. The little boats came for us, men who had lost everything. And in that moment, I knew we hadn't been abandoned. It was no longer just a rescue mission. It had become something greater, a movement of humanity, a defiance of despair." Each boat that returned to England carried not only soldiers, but stories of courage shared between strangers, of hands reaching through smoke, of the sound of propellers cutting through burning oil. The civilian Navy had done what no command could have planned. They didn't just save the army. They saved the spirit of a nation. By the time the last men were lifted from the sands of Dunkirk, the beaches were nothing but scars, littered with helmets, rifles, and the burnt skeletons of vehicles half buried in ash. The sea was quiet again, but it was not the same sea. It had swallowed fear and returned faith. When the final count was made, 338,226 soldiers had been evacuated, far beyond the Admiralty's wildest hopes. But the victory was not measured in numbers alone. It was something deeper, something that pulsed through every British heart in those dark days. Belief. Belief that even in retreat, there was courage. That even in chaos, there was unity. Had only 45,000 men been saved. As the Navy first estimated, Britain might have been forced to its knees, to negotiate, to surrender. The loss of its army would have meant the loss of its soul. But because of the little ships, because of the men who refused to watch from the shore, the nation stood unbroken. When Winston Churchill spoke to Parliament days later, his voice trembled not with despair, but with fire. "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall never surrender." Those words were not just a speech. They were a promise forged from Dunkirk, inspired by what the civilians had done. Churchill knew that the story of those small boats would reach every home, every village, every mother who feared for her son. It proved that the fight was not over. The people themselves were the fight. The psychological shockwave was enormous. For a moment, the British people looked into the abyss and saw ordinary men standing between them and oblivion. Bakers and bankers, sailors and students. They had crossed the Channel under fire and come back with their country's future in their hands. Across the Atlantic, the story spread like wildfire. Newspapers in America and Canada called it the Miracle of Dunkirk. But for those who were there, it was no miracle. It was sweat, fear, and human will. It was the quiet strength of a nation that refused to let go of its sons, and the impact didn't end with the war. Dunkirk became a lesson for the world that in the gravest crises, the power of a nation lies not only in its armies, but in the courage of its people. Decades later, governments studying evacuation and disaster relief would look back to 1940 and see it clearly. When official systems fail, humanity itself becomes the strongest force of all. Yet history, in its cold arithmetic, too often forgets the faces behind the figures. The civilian Navy faded from the spotlight, overshadowed by the grand strategies and the famous speeches. The books remembered Dunkirk, but not always the hands that pulled the drowning from the surf. Still, in quiet marinas along the English coast, the story lived on. The association of Dunkirk little ships kept many of those vessels alive, restored, preserved, and still seaworthy. Every few years, they sail again across the Channel, their engines humming softly over the same waters they once crossed through fire. They no longer carry soldiers. They carry memory. And as the waves break gently against their hulls, you can almost hear it, the echo of a nation's heartbeat, born in its darkest hour, carried still by the courage of its ordinary men. In the years that followed, people would speak of Dunkirk with reverence, as if it were a divine act of fate. But those who truly understood knew better. It wasn't fate that brought those men home. It was will. It was unity. It was the unshakable courage of citizens who refused to surrender to fear. Dunkirk was not the end. It was the proof that the strength of a nation does not rest solely in its weapons or its armies, but in the hands of those who choose to act when all seems lost. The miracle was not born from strategy or firepower. It was born from humanity itself. As one naval officer wrote in his final report, "The miracle of Dunkirk was not made by the sea, nor by the sky. It was made by men who believed that helping even one soul was worth risking their own." The civilian navy had done what history would call impossible. They had transformed defeat into defiance, chaos into courage, despair into hope. And though the world would go on to face greater storms, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the long, grueling years that followed, the spirit of Dunkirk endured like a flame that refused to die. In every crisis that came after, people remembered, when leaders falter and systems fail, it is ordinary men and women who rise. The true measure of a nation is not how it fights its wars, but how its people fight for each other. So perhaps the next time someone calls Dunkirk a military miracle, the answer should be gentle but firm. No, it was a human one, because on those gray waters, under smoke and gunfire, something larger than victory was rescued. It was faith, faith in courage, in unity, in the quiet power of those who dare to care. And as the last of the little ship still sails today, her bow cutting across the calm channel, she carries more than history. She carries a message that when the darkness returns, as it always does, hope will not come from the mighty. It will come, as it did in 1940, from the hearts of ordinary people who refuse to let the light go out.